I came home to my ranch and found an 8-foot steel wall welded straight across my driveway, still warm, still smelling like burnt metal. On the other side of it stood the HOA president in heels, smiling like she'd just repossessed my life. And right then, staring at that shiny new barrier on my land, I realized something they didn't. I owned the only piece of property that controlled the gate into their entire neighborhood. My name's Mason Hart. I'm 51, and I've lived in Redstone Valley long enough to remember when the loudest thing out here was wind in the grass. This ranch isn't a hobby or a weekend property. It's how I pay bills, feed cattle, and keep my head above water after losing my wife last year. So when a glossy new development called Silver Pine Ridge popped up beside my fence line, I wasn't thrilled, but I figured we could coexist like adults. Turns out like adults doesn't apply when a homeowners association smells money and thinks it can rewrite reality. At first it was passive-aggressive stuff, new residents posting online about odor issues, parents complaining their kids herd animals as if they thought cows were a myth. Then the fines started showing up in my mailbox with big bold headers like the HOA had become its own little government overnight. The president's name was Brooke Sterling. She had that polished boardroom voice that made every sentence sound like a threat wrapped in a smile. The first time she came to my gate, she didn't introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like a prosecutor. "Mr. Hart," she said, clipboard pressed to her chest. "Your livestock activity is negatively impacting property values. The board will be taking corrective action, on land that had been running cattle decades before her subdivision existed." I told her calmly, "This is agricultural property, always has been. Your buyers chose to move next to a ranch." She tilted her head like she was listening to a child explain dinosaurs. "We'll see what the county says," she replied, "and we'll see what your insurance says." Then she walked back to her SUV and drove off like she'd just handed me a courtesy notice before an execution. Within a week, the HOA sent someone to document violations. A guy in a neon vest stood on the road taking photos of my grass, my fences, even my barn, like he was building a case file. After that came more letters, noise citations, unsanitary conditions, even one claiming my chickens were a public health hazard. And it wasn't just the paperwork. They started installing new cameras along their side of the boundary, aimed right at my corrals. Then they hired private security not to protect anyone from crime, but to stand there with arms crossed like I was the criminal for existing. I tried to play it straight. I called the county, I pulled zoning documents, I emailed their board with polite, boring facts. I kept thinking if I stayed reasonable, this would burn out. Because normal people don't wake up wanting to fight a rancher over the existence of cows. Brooke wasn't normal. Brooke was a bulldozer in mascara. The first real punch landed on a Tuesday because apparently all disasters like to start on Tuesdays. I left the property for a few hours to deliver hay, and when I came back my driveway was gone. Not physically gone, but blocked like a prison entrance. Steel panels, thick and fresh, welded onto posts and planted right on the line where my private access road ran. I hit the brakes so hard dust exploded over my hood. For a second I just sat there staring at it, trying to process the audacity. Then I saw Brooke standing on my gravel with 2 contractors behind her arms, folded like she was posing for a magazine. She didn't even pretend. "Your access is suspended until you resolve the nuisance violations," she said. I stepped out of my truck jaw tight and said, "You put a wall on my property." She shrugged. "Our survey shows this is within the community boundary." And when she said our survey, she tapped the clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments. That was the moment anger turned into something colder. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a move. A calculated move backed by money, confident that I'd be too tired, too alone, too busy surviving to fight back. I called the sheriff. They came out, took a look, asked for paperwork, and in the most polite way possible told me it was a civil dispute, which is the legal equivalent of someone saying, "Yeah, that's messed up. Good luck." So I did what people do when they realize nobody's coming to save them. I started gathering evidence like my life depended on it. Photos, timestamps, measurements, copies of recorded plats. I hired a property attorney, Claire Jensen, who had the calm expression of someone who'd watched a lot of arrogant people talk themselves into a corner. Claire reviewed the HOA letters and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was ridiculous. They're trying to enforce their bylaws outside their jurisdiction, she said. But that steel wall, that's the part we can use. Use it. Like leverage. Meanwhile, Silver Pine Ridge residents started acting like I was the villain in their little neighborhood drama. People slowed down by my fence line staring. Someone left a note on my mailbox that said, "Move your animals or move out." I didn't respond. I didn't want to get dragged into some suburban shouting match. I just wanted my driveway back. And my peace. But peace got expensive fast, because the HOA didn't stop at the wall. They started calling inspectors, filing complaints, pushing for environmental reviews, all while smiling and saying it was for safety. One morning, I walked out and found orange flags along my boundary, like someone had marked a battlefield. The next day, I got a call from a buyer who'd been purchasing my hay for years. He hesitated, then said, "Mason, I can't be tied to controversy. I'm going to pause orders." I didn't yell at him. I didn't beg. I just hung up and stood there in my kitchen, staring at the counter, trying to do the math in my head. Lawyer bills, lost income, constant stress. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. It was crushing. There was a night, not some movie moment, just a real night where I sat in the dark with paperwork spread across the table. And I caught myself thinking, not am I wrong, but how long can I keep doing this before it breaks me? Not guilt. Exhaustion. The kind that makes your bones feel heavy. Then the twist showed up in a place I didn't expect, wearing a security uniform. The HOA had hired guards to patrol the entrance road near the subdivision gate. Most of them treated me like I was a problem to manage. But one guy, Luis Ramirez, looked at me differently, like a human being. He waited until Brooke was gone, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Sir, they're not just trying to fine you," he said. "They keep talking about an alternate access route, something behind the community." I blinked. "Alternate route to what?" He nodded toward the back end of the property line. "To the main road, without needing that gate." That hit like a punch to the chest, because suddenly everything made sense. The fines weren't the goal. The wall wasn't the goal. They were trying to cut me off, pressure me, and then carve a new entrance. So the HOA wouldn't be dependent on any property outside their control. And that's where my quiet little advantage became a loaded weapon. Years earlier, before Silver Pine Ridge ever existed, an old man named Otto Krieger owned a tiny 2-acre parcel right at the mouth of the community entrance. Most people ignored it because it was just scrubland and a utility shed. But I didn't ignore it, because I read old county records the way some people read bedtime stories. I had already purchased that parcel, not for revenge, not for drama, for protection. Because buried in the recorded documents was language about easements and access control tied to that parcel, including the mechanical override and legal authority connected to the gate system. In plain English, the HOA had a fancy electronic gate, but the real control was older than their bylaws, and it didn't belong to them. Claire didn't even look surprised when I told her. She just nodded once and said, "Okay, now we stop playing defense." Then she started making calls, sending notices, filing complaints, and requesting records with the kind of precision that makes bullies nervous. Brooke, of course, doubled down. Because people like her don't retreat when they're wrong, they retreat when they're cornered. They sent a survey crew behind the neighborhood, marking trees and digging shallow trenches. They claimed it was for stormwater management. But the pattern of stakes and spray paint looked an awful lot like the beginning of a road. Claire asked for permits. They didn't have them. So I did something simple. I forwarded photos and coordinates to the right county office, the one that handles protected land and environmental violations. No speeches, no threats, just facts. A week later, inspectors rolled in with clipboards that made Brooks look like a toy. They issued stop work orders, fines, and warnings, the kind that come with real consequences. And for the first time, I saw a crack in her confidence. But she still had one more card she thought would scare me. She hired a private investigator to follow me. I noticed the same car parked across from my mailbox 2 days in a row, the same guy pretending to check his phone while he photographed my property. On the third day, he stepped onto my land to get a better angle. Bad choice. I walked out calmly and said, "You're trespassing." He smirked. "I'm on a public easement." So I held up the boundary map and said, "No, you're standing exactly where the easement ends. Take one more step and I'm calling it in. He took the step. I made the call. That incident turned into a report. The report turned into questions, and when Claire discovered certain mail notices had been tampered with dates, shifted delivery claims that didn't match tracking, it pulled in another layer of attention that Brooke absolutely didn't want. By the time the HOA scheduled their emergency board meeting, the air around Silver Pine Ridge was thick with rumors. Some residents were angry at me, some were angry at the board, and most were just angry they couldn't get a straight answer. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. I picked 6:30 p.m. for my move because that's when people come home when traffic stacks up and patience runs out. Not to punish the residents, but to expose the truth in the most visible way possible. I drove to that tiny utility shed on the parcel I owned. I opened a panel that looked like it hadn't been touched since flip phones were cool. Inside was the old mechanical system tied to the gate, the kind that doesn't care about HOA votes or Brooke's clipboard. My hand hovered for a second. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this would do. It would force everyone to see the reality Brooke had been hiding. Then I turned the key. Click. The gate didn't explode or spark like in movies. It just stopped responding the way it normally did. A clean, quiet failure. The kind that makes people panic because it's boring and unstoppable. 10 minutes later, the line of cars began. Headlights, brake lights, honking residents stepping out in work clothes, kids in the back seats getting restless. And there stood Brooke, in her perfect blazer, staring at her phone like it had betrayed her. I walked up, not yelling, not grandstanding, and held up a folder. "Brooke," I said loud enough for the nearest people to hear, "that wall on my land is illegal. Your board's enforcement outside your boundary is illegal, and the permits you don't have. That's illegal too." Her eyes narrowed. "You're sabotaging community access," she snapped. I nodded once. "No, I'm exercising my legal control over this gate system until the trespass and harassment stop." People started murmuring. A man in a suit shouted, "Wait! You control the gate!" A woman near the front said, "Brooke told us you were threatening the neighborhood." Brooke tried to regain the room, raising her voice like volume could rewrite facts. "Everyone, please, this man is retaliating because he refuses to comply with community standards." I looked at the crowd and said, "Standards don't apply on property the homeowners association doesn't own." Right then the clubhouse doors opened in the distance, because the meeting had started, and Brooke thought she'd use it to paint me as the villain one more time. I followed the flow of people to the clubhouse slow and steady, like I had all the time in the world. Inside, Brooke stood at the front trying to deliver her speech about safety and quality of life, like she wasn't the one who welded a wall onto somebody else's land. She got 2 minutes in before the real interruption arrived. Detective Evan Cole walked in with 2 other officials behind him. Not private security, not HOA volunteers. People with badges, neutral faces, and paperwork that didn't care about her title. "Brooke Sterling," the detective said, voice calm. "We need to speak with you." She stiffened. "This is a private meeting." He didn't blink. "It's not private when it involves reported trespass, fraudulent documentation, and ongoing violations connected to restricted land." You could feel the room shift. The residents stopped filming and started listening for real. Brooke tried to laugh it off, that brittle little laugh people do when they're losing control. "This is ridiculous," she said. "He's manipulating, ma'am." The detective cut in turnaround. The moment the cuffs came out, every confident word she'd ever thrown at me collapsed into silence. Her clipboard slid off the table and hit the floor with a sharp slap that echoed through the clubhouse. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else said, "She lied to us." Brooke's face went pale, then red, then something close to panic. But there was no dramatic meltdown, no villain speech, just consequences, plain, heavy, and real. As they led her out, she turned her head toward me, eyes furious, searching for a final stab. I didn't give her one. I just stood there with my hands at my sides, breathing through the adrenaline, watching the authority she worshipped get stripped away in 30 seconds. Outside, I walked back to the utility shed. I turned the key back. Click. The gate system woke up like nothing had happened. Cars began moving again, a slow stream of people returning to their lives, but now with the truth sitting in their throats. The steel wall came down days later, not because Brooke asked nicely, but because the right paperwork finally had teeth. And the HOA stopped sending me letters, stopped sending guards, stopped acting like my ranch was their personal inconvenience. I didn't throw a party. I didn't pose for photos. I just stepped onto my porch that night, listened to the quiet, and let my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Because the lesson wasn't about winning, it was about boundaries. Power doesn't belong to the loudest person with a clipboard. It belongs to the person who owns the truth on paper in black and white.